Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for July 21st, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by special guest, Mike Cotton. Welcome, Mike. Mike, you're the Vice President for Research and Development at Digital Defense.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So welcome. Tell us a little about your company and what you do.
Yeah, we provide managed vulnerability scanning and vulnerability management services to companies, Fortune 500 financial vertical, and we also perform penetration tests, kind of in line with regulations and other sorts of things that are necessary to kind of fulfill obligations, due to security.
Right. So how did you get into the security industry?
I started a long time ago, and it's kind of relevant to AT&T. I actually started in kind of the data telecom networking space, working for a security division. And then when there started to be a big shift, the warm attacks started hitting in 2003, 2004, it became clear that there was a really large problem. That's when I kind of elected to make a career shift and go down to a dedicated, auditing firm. My big motivation was I wanted to be in a position to look at a lot of different companies, to actually see, not just work on one network, but actually work with lots and lots of different companies, get a broader view. It's more interesting. So.
Yeah. I'm sure you get to see lots of a variety of things in the penetration testing world, right?
Yeah. No, we really do. Yeah. We also work in vulnerability scanning, which is nice because you kind of can give people an automated view. It's kind of a high-level view of, somebody was doing a penetration test. These are the sorts of things you might want to look out for. And then because we vertically integrate those penetration services in, clients have the opportunity to come to us and say, okay, well, let's make that happen. I'm curious to see this actually play out. It's kind of a good mix of hypothetical and real world. So.
Good. Well, I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about some of those topic areas today. We have Matt Kaiser joining us today. Welcome back, Matt.
How's it going, Brad?
John Hogoboom.
Here I am.
I'm Brian Rexroad, and so let's talk first, Mike, about the old holes don't seem to go away, do they?
No, they don't. It's something. Even when I first got into security, I remember I'd go and I'd talk to kind of our senior researchers, and I'd say, wow, I just saw this thing hit the wire. Are you guys? I bet you're using that to pop domains today or to get into places. And they're like, no. I mean, we're just using the same stuff we've been using the last 2 years. It's not that they don't incorporate new tools and tactics. They do. It's just that it's something where when you have old, reliable vectors in your tool chain that just constantly work, you tend to go back to those again and again. And so sometimes, the hype cycle of new vulnerabilities sometimes outweighs. People see all the noise in the news. They think, this is what I need to focus on, but they leave these kind of less sexy flaws that have been there for years alone. So,
that's a very good point. And perhaps two things that we can expand on just a bit. First of all, there's been a lot of buzz around the growth of mobile malware. And I don't think it's because of the lack of vulnerabilities. I think it's the lack of need to abandon the old vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think mobile malware is something where, those devices started, they were locked down a lot better from the start. One of the problems that Windows has consistently run into in corporate networks are it's very, very hard to kind of make big changes after the fact. And when we're working with clients, we constantly see, even when you set up a Windows domain, they put this big box in front of you, and they basically say, do you want everything to work, or do you want to be secure? And it's pretty easy to figure out what people choose. But that actually plays into some of these some of these things we'll talk about. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the other aspect of it is a penetration tester. It seems like if you go into an enterprise and show, you know what, this vulnerability from 2011 works. It seems like the story might be even a little more compelling than if you say, I just picked up this vulnerability that's discovered last week.
Right. And a lot of these flaws are, they're unpatched too. A lot of times the things that tend to really trip people up, even with a good information security program, are things that they're like subtle configuration issues. Sometimes they didn't have a CVE associated with them. But if it gets you from point A to point B, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So.
Internally, we were just and this is just a sort of an exercise in intellectual exercise we were working on. We were trying to create something along the lines of the 10 commandments of security. And one of my favorite ones going years back is that in security, the details matter.
Yeah.
You only have to get one thing wrong.
I guess they call that the defender's dilemma, I think. Just one vector.
I meant to ask, and the flaws that keep cropping up, the ones that have the longest lifetime, I guess, is there something specific about those flaws? I mean, yes, that they work, but why are these the ones that haven't been patched? Is it that Microsoft hasn't patched them, or that people are reluctant to apply the patches that exist? I mean, what is it?
I mean, it depends. I mean, sometimes, like with device issues, you run into situations where there's no really good kind of patching mechanism in place. If you're talking about machines on your Windows network, a lot of times companies have gotten good at building a patch management program, pushing things out. A lot of times you'll see, like with devices, they'll let you, for instance, when all the baseboard flaws came out in the last 2 years and got a lot of focus, well, depending on the network setup, those will let you go ahead and kind of take almost like a physical control of a Windows machine, turn it off, change the boot media, mount offline stores, start to take things off the root partition now that Windows is shut down. That's actually a device flaw, but it actually lets you get into privileged Windows machines, but it sits outside the patch management process. Right. So there's been a lot of high-profile flaws with baseboard protocols like IPMI and Cypher0 and things like that. Basically, it lets you take flaws that are outside the normal, kind of hype and Microsoft patch cycle, but go after Windows networks. The other sorts of flaws you see are, kind of like I mentioned, flaws where Microsoft keeps saying you really should turn this off, but we're not going to do it for you because we might just break a bunch of stuff. We really don't want to do that. That's a tremendous burden. I mean, when you have every conceivable combination of software and hardware out there, it's really hard to know if we push this change out. You can kind of see them tiptoeing with Windows 8 and Windows 10 saying, let's try to make this non-default and see what happens, but that tends to be what we see. So.
Yeah. Are there some good checklists for, if you're setting up a system to go through and make sure that you've got most of the bases covered anyway? Of course, the details matter. Right?
Yeah, that's right. No, it is. I mean, I think it's something where you've got to go ahead and focus on, number one, making sure you're not running unnecessary services, making sure as you go ahead and push out patches and things like that, you're cognizant of what are these protocols and things that seem to keep having issues over and over again.
Right.
One thing we sometimes talk about with people, and this crops up over and over, is the need to really try to lock down username enumeration and easily guessable passwords on their domain. And unfortunately, the way that most corporate networks are structured, you can easily have kind of these centralized points in the network where, you'll get a list of 5,000 usernames, and you start going through, and it's going to be either username, or username in some simple combination. And if you grind that, you'll get some. And you may not get a lot, but you don't need a lot to go ahead and actually take all those creds and then start looking where else in the network does this get me.
Yeah.
Laterally moving,
that lateral movement.
So it seems like the complex password enforcement is a critical aspect of it, certainly on a
it is, but I mean our guys, they guess username, and then they do, okay, it's complex on, and then it's capital P, password 1, 2, 3. It's and we get it. Your people don't have to just turn it on; they have to believe in it too.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Yeah, you're right about that. So we've talked about some vulnerabilities in general. Let's talk about a specific one and the patch cycle. So John, if you could tell us a little bit about the out-of-cycle patching that Windows
so there's an out-of-band security patch that Microsoft pushed out. It's MS15078. It came out yesterday. And so we're talking about like the old vulnerabilities tend to still work. This particular vulnerability kind of came on the heels of the hacking team data breach. They had a bunch of zero-day exploits that were kind of in that cache of data that was leaked. This is one of them. It's classified as critical. It affects all versions of Windows, at least back to XP, including Windows 10, which is not released yet. It is a flaw in the Windows Adobe Type Manager, that's not an Adobe necessarily vulnerability like we think of Flash, but the Adobe Type Manager is kind of a partnership between Microsoft and Adobe. It's a standard they came up with together. Anyway, it can trigger remote code execution. If you go to a web page that tries to have open type fonts in it, they could leverage that remote code execution. The troublesome thing about this one is it's relatively easy to exploit, and it's it's kind of reliable too. Unlike some of these other ones where you might have to kind of get really lucky or have a kind of a magic luck happenstance to make it happen, it's a little bit easier than usual in order to exploit. As far as everyone else has said, I haven't really seen this being exploited in the wild yet. Probably should want to patch it sooner than later.
So I'm curious, if this came out of the hacking team, it kind of suggests that, and certainly the vulnerability, if it applies all the way back to XP, it's been around for a while. I've heard a lot of abuses of the term 0 day. Why hasn't somebody come up and said the minus 360 day? It's been used for the last year or 2 years or 3 years, and nobody really noticed that it was being used, and here we are, finally discovered it. So sorry victims, but finally there's a patch.
Right. And there are some workarounds. If you can't deploy the patch for some reason, there are some kind of manual, you can disable some of these features in Windows manually, but I'd recommend install the patch if you can across your environment.
Mike, I think you had mentioned a little bit earlier about how the font parsing was kind of a ring zero thing. They're trying to work on fixing that.
It was kind of surprising. I think years ago, and I think this was in the Longhorn era, I think Microsoft experimented with, saying we should take some of the stuff out of the kernel, move it to, managed code, and ran into speed issues and other sorts of things like that. Put it back into the kernel, but unfortunately, now when you blow a buffer in the kernel, you're in much, much worse shape from a sandbox environment and other sorts of protections mechanisms. And this was out of band, and Microsoft doesn't do a lot of truly out of band off of Patch Tuesday, maybe only, 2 or 3 a year or something like that. So it means their guys, it's still, full details are still releasing, but their guys must think it's pretty serious. And we just had Patch Tuesday, so.
Well, I think the availability of an exploit would be a pretty
right, but even still, we've seen other cases where there's been availability of an exploit, but they haven't done a out-of-band patch for it.
But you did point.
I think they're a little bit more concerned about how easy this one is to leverage.
The reliability that you suggested as well. Yep, absolutely. All right, well, good point. So vulnerabilities and exposures. Mike, do you have some advice you can give us on, how should we be dealing with some of these crazy things that are coming up?
It's, obviously it's a challenge anytime you have a large network to secure, you have so many users. I think, the thing that I talk to people about the most is, number one, sweep your networks, get a handle on where you're at. Actually go ahead and actually gain that visibility. Utilize your patch management system, to go ahead and inform you. Also try to use, tool chains that do explicit probing. The other thing I'd say too is as you're going around and managing these devices, try to have an aggressive program of really, saying, do we need this and can we turn this off?
Right.
It's something we see, constantly that I've seen a lot of incidents, where we've been working with clients and they're secure, and then they've got this thing in the corner that no one's thought about for 10 years. It's still on, turns out it's still on XP, and that becomes the domino that knocks down the entire thing. People roll that up, they gain credentials, move laterally, and it goes all the way to the top. They focus on, kind of these central servers. They put a lot of security protections in place. They really heavily fortify them, thinking, when the attack hits that server, we're going to have all the IPS and everything else in place. But the thing that they don't realize is when the attack hits that server, it's not an attack anymore. It's just somebody logging in with administrator credentials they already have. You just look like the good guys at that point. That's the thing that we work with people a lot. And it's a challenge. The inclination, I think, of most people, and I've run IT networks myself, I'm the same way, is just to hey, everything's working, just leave it alone. If we turn it off, maybe someone's going to complain, right?
Yeah.
So And so,
Yep.
I mean, that's a challenge.
I think you're absolutely right. The cleaning up the old things is probably one of the perhaps least considered, but perhaps one of the most important things to consider in getting, tightening things up. Even just in terms of backward compatibility. If you have older systems, the strength of credentials isn't as strong. You might not have the same patch controls that.
Yeah, it's something too. I've seen instances where people will have kind of two-factor authentication. You have RSA and things like that. A lot of times with some of the tool chains, if you can pop these old systems and somebody happens to log in through it, you can go ahead and actually steal the second factor in a cached fashion and then start leveraging that through the network. So even if you're thinking, okay, well, I've got good end user protection, they can still bite you. But like I said, a tremendous sympathy for IT guys, because like I said, sometimes you turn off the wrong system and that bites you too.
When you're talking about vulnerability scanning, I think it's important for enterprises to not consider that everything's going to be a Windows machine. Make sure, and then if you actually study what you get back from these results, you'll probably find there's a lot of interesting equipment on your network that you didn't know about. And from HVAC systems, things that control the doors, like all kinds of just elements that have been placed in your network, not by you or by your security team, and whoever put it there gave no consideration to the fact that security was a factor. I remember we ran into some stuff with like a gas pumping equipment for like pumping gas into your trucks for vendors and whatnot. So it's interesting what you might find if you actually kind of study your results of what you get back in your vulnerability scans.
Absolutely true. Matt, there was an activity to take down Darkode.
That's right.
I think I'm still trying to get my head around this. What is the significance?
So the significance is Darkode was a major underground cybercrime forum. I mean, there were major players involved here. The original Mariposa botnet, you remember that one? The creator of it was one of the original founding members of Darkode, according to the article here on Krebs on Security. The creator of the Crime Pack exploit kit was involved in the forum. Paunch, who was known as the creator of Black Hole exploit kit, was a member of the forum. Even more recently, apparently Spec, or Specialist, is a major player in the forum, was also a member of Lizard Squad, apparently. So there's a lot of stories going on in this one forum. So apparently a coordinated takedown for a number of law enforcement agencies across the world, and a number of arrests, searches, and indictments, including 12 indictments in the United States.
Wow.
So this is kind of a big deal. I mean, this was sort of a hotbed of activity. And when I say hotbed, it's just sort of relative terms. There were apparently only about 250 to 300 members on the forum. But if you get enough concentrated talent in one place, it can be a major hotbed of activity. This is generally good news. There's lots of stuff coming out of this now that the place has been taken down. Krebs has actually posted some photos or screenshots from the forums, so giving you sort of an inside view as to what was going on. Most people wouldn't have had that view because it was a password-protected forum with a vetting system set up where, if you wanted to get in, you had to have someone vouch for you. Then you had to present yourself as, I'm doing these criminal activities, please review me and decide if I'm a worthwhile member. So it takes a little bit of work to get inside. Apparently,
So almost gang-like behavior.
exactly. There's a certain cost to entry that you have to be willing to put up with. So far, it doesn't seem that they had to, actively commit a crime to get in, but as long as they could, they had a vouch and they had, evidence of past crimes, they were able to get in. Now, it seems that both law enforcement and Brian Krebs were able to infiltrate Darkode at some point. Now, this is a story coming from both law enforcement and Brian Krebs, but given that we have enough evidence here in these screenshots, it seems that this was the case, that there was significant law enforcement presence in there at one point, taking a look at things, and probably how they built their case for taking it down.
Wow. So I have to, to both. I think this is a positive thing in the sense that it does create a greater deterrence, maybe even in the context of, in a vetted community. How much confidence do you have that you're actually in
That there isn't an insider?
In an insider, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, a mole of some sort. But also, sort of a shout out to Brian Krebs. He always seems to have good that extra little bit of insight into events that are taking place. And so
I read up on this one. It was interesting that
Yeah.
it seemed like the site operators, they knew that somebody was onto them.
Really?
They knew that someone was leaking information out. It's almost like the joke, is it paranoia if they're really out to get you? And so I think I saw they devised some system of like reputation and user ID
that was
where
cool.
they could see if somebody posted a screenshot, like a really subtle thing you wouldn't think about, like what's your reputation?
Yeah, there's like a reputation score within the forum, and it
Oh,
appears
right.
next to each user's name, except based on who was viewing the page, that value would change. And by a mathematical formula, we could say, okay, well, I know the real reputation value is this, and the user ID that's logged in is this, so I can tell who was logged in and who took the screenshot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was kind of neat.
Interesting.
It's pretty
A little
sneaky.
clever watermarking kind
Exactly.
of scheme. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how long that type of activity has been around, but one of those things to be watching out for.
So I guess the big question on everyone's mind right now is what's going to happen next. I mean, Darkode is gone. That doesn't mean the underground is gone by any means. I mean,
Right.
some people are speculating they're going to move to some place on maybe a Tor hidden service or some other dark website. It's going to continue on in one way or the other. But I think your point that there's a major deterrent factor to show that you can't just act with impunity. You can't just have a situation where people are allowed to commit these crimes and not go unpunished.
Incidentally, with any indications of what types of charges the folks have been?
There's a list of charges on both the DOJ website and the FBI website. They list out who was indicted and for what. And there's some interesting characters in that list as well.
All right, but I would think that participating in a forum would not be.
At least a few people were in there for some sort of conspiracy to commit certain crimes.
Okay.
Spam, cybercrime, bank fraud, those sorts of things.
All right. Well, we've talked a little bit about vulnerabilities, how to protect against those, but how do we, what's a good way to deal with data breaches, Mike?
Data breaches are tough, because of the defender's dilemma, the idea that just one single weak point can go ahead and collapse the whole pyramid. And
Right.
unfortunately, the way that networks are structured, it really is that way. People go from machine to machine, and it's almost like after they get that foothold, they just get more and more power, more credentials, more access, and then it spreads. And so, initial entry point is really, really critical. It really is something where, once they're through the first couple stages, the odds they're going to be able to dramatically spread laterally are astronomical. So. One thing that I sometimes quote to people is, back in 2007, Steve Jobs, came out with this bold, statement of which was that we are not going to use Flash anymore on these mobile devices. Its security record has got problems, all sorts of other things. Just the other day, you actually saw Firefox shut down Flash globally. Set a kill bit. The problem is then they turned it back on, once the patches came out. It's one of those things where I think enough of the web has moved away from it now. You saw this big drive away from Java a couple of years ago when the exploits got so bad. It really is time, I'd say, to stop patching Flash in your corporate security policy and actually start turning it off everywhere. Just treat the installation of it as that security risk. The other sorts of things are, when people are coming at you for that initial point of entry, you get these spam emails and they're these very crude attacks, and people get used to seeing them and thinking, that's the kind of stuff I need to look out for.
Right.
But a lot of times working with clients and seeing, how they get impacted by some of these things, it's really the clever ones are the ones where they think they know the person, they're used to interacting with people from their healthcare provider or their audit firm. Those associations are probably public record. They're used to random people showing up and kind of doing interactions. And so, those loose trust relationships a company develops, a lot of times those are the sorts of things that actually convince you to go ahead and open that attachment or go to that website that you maybe shouldn't go to in a creative attack. Those are the sorts of things where, even when you see people trained in information security, really well crafted spear phishing attacks can actually get people who are
Certain-
very, very
yeah,
well trained.
They can be pretty tricky. I tend to think of this in layers. First layer being basically the email scanning on the front end to try to identify malicious behaviors associated with it. You mentioned or spoofed addressing, that sort of thing. The initial gateway should be able to filter a lot of that activity out. It's going to miss some things.
Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges, a lot of times is when you're talking about, we got into the situation where people were filtering out spam, filtering out kind of bad messages, and they started really relying on mail transfer agent reputation and other sorts of things. And then they started getting to kind of domain DKIP validation and things that allow you to kind of verify, is this person sending me the address, the person who should be. But a lot of times I've seen kind of advanced tactics where people are renting out, virtual servers on major web hosting providers, and because, major web hosting providers host hundreds of thousands of domains, they're kind of whitelisted for everything. So spoofed mail going through those domains will show up a lot of times under typical settings in your corporate inbox, and it can be anyone. It can be the CEO mailing you. And unfortunately, the technology that was built to combat that, PGP, unfortunately has kind of fallen out of use. And so, we started to see more and more of, kind of email spoofing make its way back into hacker toolkits and being used in some pretty impressive attacks. So.
All right. So, and I guess to your point, second layer being the person looking at the email, and a well-crafted email is going to be able to get by the scrutiny of an end user.
Yeah.
Certainly your typical end user, and if not, perhaps even a well-educated one. We get so much email these days. Yeah. How can you scrutinize every one of them, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's something where it depends. Even things that are a little bit out of the ordinary, you have to red flag. We were talking earlier about the CHM exploits. It's kind of people used to send you an EXE in the mail, and then people stopped clicking on that, so you put a Word icon on it, and then they stopped clicking on it, so you threw in a zip file and you sent it in there so it didn't get filtered. And I've seen people use, kind of these HTML help files, CHM, which they kind of looks like an HTML file. If you download it and double click it, it just runs code, and it doesn't even pop a UAC warning. CryptoWallet's using this now in a big way that it wasn't before, and I think you mentioned you'd seen APT variants.
Yeah, I've seen some nation-state actors use it a while back.
Yeah, that are using it, but it still, I mean, even on fully patched machines, it still works the same way. So
right.
that's kind of what's old is new again. Is it's like we can do this big complex thing. Let's just send them an executable and see if he clicks on it. So
yeah. So obviously those two layers aren't enough. You need more layers in the infrastructure to be able to help prevent basically the extension of these activities, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think layering on security technologies is good, but end user training is also effective. I mean, I always tell people don't give out your password. Like play somebody an audio clip of an advanced social engineer talking somebody out of their password. It used to be something where I'd see people do this in challenges. They would never get people to do this because they've been so trained, but the more and more you actually see people get better and better at social engineering, and they just get very, very good at establishing trust and saying, hey, can you just help me out? Like, I'm an IT guy, your system's messing up, just I mean, you don't have to give it to me, but if you can help me out. And
all right. Absolutely. Since you mentioned the user training aspect, we have an internal user training program. But the slogan around it is "You are the firewall." We have a little cartoon character, Murray, that is a part of each of those that helps to just make it a little more light. The training activities. I think there are 4 videos that are actually posted on the internet that are available for folks to take a look at that are intended that organizations can use it if they want to do that. So it's I think along the theme, but I think you had a very good example, that is to actually hear an example of somebody social engineering a password. I think would be a really good training opportunity for a lot of folks that haven't seen how crafty some of these people are.
Yeah. I mean, I think, kind of the big conferences, like I think DEF CON puts on a social engineering, kind of challenge every year. Yeah, capture the flag, and then they play, audio clips of it, and it's, these guys are really skilled. But I mean, just listening to those audio clips can really teach you a lot about, no one picks up the phone and says, "Hey, can you just give me your credentials?" I mean, it's a lot more subtle than that. So.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good point. That the having an appreciation for those subtleties is an important part of the training activity. So, perhaps something we can take under consideration. So let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And the first thing I want to just give a little bit of an update. I think when we looked at it a couple of weeks ago, we had just had learned of the use of RIP, that is Routing Information Protocol, being used in reflective denial of service attacks. Of course, we've been tracking a lot of activity, or the on and off activity associated with using SNMP, that's port 161 UDP, RIP being port 520 UDP, both of which have been used in reflective denial of service attacks. This is just an update, as I said, and we are still seeing some. The red spikes here associated with RIP activity. So it's actually larger in terms of the activity that we're seeing in those denial of service attacks. Not really significant. In fact, we'll put it into context in a little bit here, but we are seeing attacks in the gigabit range, so something that we'll want to keep an eye on. Look for the opportunity for deterrence there. And speaking of deterrence, what I'm showing here is actually SSDP, that's port 1900 UDP, and we've been reporting that this has been a problematic port over the last several months, used in reflective denial of service attacks as well. And so one of the things that we've been working on is putting some blocks into the network. SSDP is intended to be a LAN protocol. There really is not any purpose for routing it across the internet. Clearly, with these denial of service attacks taking place, the damage that occurs with these, these are devices that are actually inadvertently exposing SSDP to the internet, in itself could present a vulnerability to the device itself. So the consequence of blocking it is much less than the consequence of leaving it open. And so there's some blocking activities being put into place, and you can see the effects of that. Now, this is looking at the request side. So we're blocking the requests that would subsequently result in attack activity, but that does not block the activity of basically responses that are coming into the network, at least from the perspective of this analysis platform. So in any case, there can be attack activity coming into the network from other sources, and that still shows up as taking place. That hasn't, those blocks have not created a deterrent there, but I think from a customer's point of view, they would be protected against those attack activities. Now, I think, and I'm only speculating a little bit here, but as a consequence of that blocking activity, there is a little bit of evidence of perhaps some increased scanning activity, perhaps trying to find devices that are willing to respond to SSDP. Again, speculative on my part, but we will be keeping an eye to see if there's an increase in that reconnaissance activity. So if we put all of these things together, inclusive with DNS port 5319, which is charge-in, a lot of people like to call it, character generator, NTP, which is port 123 UDP, as well as packet fragmentation, you can see there's still a large collection of reflective denial of service activity on the network, but the SNMP and the RIP activity are really way down in the noise here. They're not even significant relative to the other activities taking place. So we still have some activity some opportunities for improvement in that area. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports at the top of the list here, we have port 23. We were talking about this earlier. For the most part, this is scanning activity looking for the Internet of insecure devices that haven't been well designed to be connected to the internet, or exposing port 23 to the internet. This is one of these old holes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Telnet's just not one of those things you want to use anymore.
Right, yeah. No, I mean, you see that fairly commonly, unfortunately, and devices continue to be just a big challenge for organizations to bring into their vulnerability management process. Everyone wants to have kind of the big green button you push every Patch Tuesday, and But unfortunately, devices, it's a lot of these, it's just, you just got to pound it out one device at a time.
Yeah.
So.
My personal opinion is that a good portion of the device industry simply has not matured. As Microsoft went through their maturing process and finally got to the point where patches are pretty much automatic. You don't have to really do much if you don't want to, and if you're an enterprise, you can gain some control of that. But the devices manufacturers often they don't really have a patching process in the first place. And you'd actually mentioned it earlier in a different context. That is, the systems devices that don't really have good patch processes around them yet. And so
a lot of times, it becomes a problem when you can use that to go ahead and kind of cross over and gain administration capabilities, like with baseboard management systems and things like that. A lot of times they actually have capability of taking over Windows nodes because they sit at a very high privilege level. They're effectively the kind of the on-off switch, remote CD-ROM, things like that. And so that's kind of a really bad area where you kind of have the worst of both worlds. You both have, if a device that doesn't have privileged access to anything gets breached, it's bad, but it's not quite as bad as if a system that has access, kind of super user privileges over a very, very highly secured system becomes breached, and those flaws are still very, very prevalent, among the most prevalent flaws that we see. So.
Yeah, we saw a password bypass vulnerability associated with backboard access tools some time ago. That was, and the effects that there was a...
That's right, the Cipher 0 flaw, and that flaw is still very, very prevalent. So.
Moving on here, the second in line here, port 80 TCP, that jumped up 6 slots in terms of the amount of activity. I think we're going to take a look at that, at least in perhaps a little different context a little bit later on here. Port 22 TCP, we're going to take a little closer look at that because that is sort of on an interesting trend. Most of these others we've talked about before. We already talked about 1900 UDP and its relationship to reflective denial of service attacks. We almost always see 1433 TCP in here. That's Microsoft SQL database. Looking for those weak passwords and opportunities.
Still SA no password is still out there.
It's just a database, right? Is it? And then 3389 remote desktop protocol in the list as well. Incidentally, 3840 other ports and protocols that were being probed in this one-day measurement cycle here. So a lot of ports being targeted these days. A lot of them are even just like really esoteric ports, but they are associated with backdoors or other very proprietary applications. This is not on the list. The probes on port 135 TCP, I thought it would be worth showing to you. We've been reporting on this for some time. We're showing 120 days of activity, and you can see where the activity had been ramping up, and then it vanished. And so there's very little probing on port 135 TCP right now, but as we've reported before, this had been generally associated with a number of sources that are actually appears to be hosted in the United States, but registered to China.
And they appear to be very old Windows 2003 machines
That's
that would be vulnerable to that. I forget what the exploit is against 135 TCP.
Yeah, so it's not clear whether these were exploited machines that are being used as a part of a botnet activity or if they were...
And they all have a very old Internet Information Server running on there with a Chinese default web page that says, hey, your server's been set up or whatever. So very strange.
Very strange, next item here, probes on port 23 TCP. That, as we said, those at the top of the list here. We're showing 60 days of data, and you can see here that just in the last day or so, we've seen a relatively large spike in the number of probes that are taking place. If you look really closely, you can see sort of the decay pattern. So this is, I suspect, a botnet that's basically sent out a command to do some scanning, most likely devices, internet devices. And when I looked through the list, over the course of the day, in fact, we had over 80,000 sources that were doing the probing activity. The most active sources were out of China. Now, I guess on a positive note, looking at sort of the port you probably want to be using instead of Telnet. This is port 22 TCP, that's SSH. We're looking at the last 365 days of activity, and clearly since about the beginning of May, we're seeing a pretty significant decline in the amount of probes on that port. I'm not sure if that's going to be a lasting trend, but certainly it is a positive one from our point of view. Looking at the most sources doing the probing, at the top of the list, port 23, we've already talked about that in terms of the number of probes. We'll look at it again in terms of the number of sources that are doing that probing. And similarly for port 443 and 80 TCP, the next two in the list, we'll take a look at those. And John, I think you'll have a little description for us. Most of these others we've talked about before. Port 23 TCP, as I'd mentioned earlier, we saw the spike in the probing activity, and we also see it in the number of sources that are doing that probing. This is measuring up around 80,000 sources that we see doing that probing activity. Again, invariably, the Internet of Insecure Things. Normally, this is password guessing activities, and it's sometimes not even guessing, it's just using the default passwords for these devices to get into it. We are seeing sort of a climbing trend. This is not the peak of what we've seen over the last, say, year ago, but we certainly, this is certainly climbing, and perhaps we'll continue to do that. And then looking at the activity on port 80 TCP and 443 TCP, this is a little bit of a strange situation where we saw some relatively unusual spikes in the number of sources probing on port 80 and 443. Now, it showed up here, but John, I think when you were looking at it, you saw that they were probing a number of other ports as well. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's very strange because I think our algorithms got a little confused.
Yeah, that's a possibility. So what we saw in this flow activity was predominantly ACK resets, which would be a response.
Right. So our scan volumetric algorithms were looking at ACK resets, thinking that was a scan. But in reality, there were SYNs sent as well. So it appears that what someone is doing is sending spoof source IP, source port of 443, some random destination IP, destination ports of like 80, 8080, 5900, all these ones that you would scan for normally to see if you could. But why they would spoof the source IP, I don't know, because you're not going to get the answer back. But there was also one IP that was maybe spoofed, maybe not, that was doing the same type of activity with the same source port of 443 that was doing a lot more of this activity. So he was getting a lot of backscatter of all this activity as well, which I don't know if that was some sort of denial of service attempt, like a kind of faux reflective denial of service, because all he's going to get back are ACK resets from other people, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so we may be seeing a couple of different things going on here, perhaps some scanning activity combined with some denial of service activity, and it's a little difficult to say. The variety of addresses could actually be explained by a botnet doing this scanning activity. Not really clear. So some more investigation perhaps, but just keep an eye out for this. This is obviously, you aren't necessarily in a position to be able to shut down port 80 and 443, but at least understanding the activity that's taking place there and being aware of it will be your one step better from a protection point of view. Well, that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&T ThreatTraq at list.att.com. And you can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel, on YouTube, as well as on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at AT&T Security. And Mike, do you have a Twitter handle?
Yeah, it's at mcotton256.
All right, good. So if you'd like to get and provide some feedback to Mike or to give a shout out for the program, we'd appreciate that as well. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thanks, Matt. John, I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.